So, Marco Iacoboni is a professor of psychiatry, biobehavioral science at UCLA, and works on, well, his most recent book is on mirror neurons, as Ramachandran was alluding to earlier, science of how we connect with others. And I think that's what will be the burden of your talk, right? Yeah, okay.
So the case I want to make today is that, in fact, there is, or at least the kind of morality I'm interested in, is the morality that actually is relevant to empathy and fairness. So it's kind of a change of tone compared to the previous talk, which was actually quite interesting. And I want to talk about the evolutionary precursors of morality, because as a neuroscientist, I think that I study the brain, and our brain doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from a process which is called evolution. And so we can actually study animals and study the brain of animals and understand our own brain. I think that one thing I want to say is that the kind of foundational aspects of morality I'm interested in are really empathy and fairness, which I think John would consider the second aspect, first and second. And in fact, there is now a wave of empirical work on empathy and fairness, and you could see that there are some trends. In fact, when it comes to empathy, there's plenty of studies that are really interested in imitation and mirroring, and I'm interested in those studies. I've done several of those studies, and I'm going to talk about mostly of this kind of research. But there's also plenty of research on fairness, and now there is a large trend in neuroeconomics that is interested in fairness, and we may hear something about it tomorrow. But I also want to say that even fairness, which seems something that is so uniquely human, in fact, there is evidence that it comes all the way back. And certainly the guy that has studied fairness behavior in monkeys most extensively is certainly Frans de Waal. And he has done several studies on this. I want to single out only a couple of them. One was published in Nature in 2003, and one very recently in PNAS. And in the first one, what they show is that if you look at monkeys' behavior, monkeys refuse to participate if they witness a conspecific obtain a more attractive reward for equal effort. So I think it's a very important finding, because it really tells us that some aspects of morality and fairness that we think are so entrenched to our being human, in fact, come really all the way back. And we really have to think, we have this tendency to think about ourselves as on a pedestal, kind of different from other species. But it's very important to anchor all our properties and functions in the evolutionary framework. And the other one that I think I want to briefly point out is this study recently published on in which monkeys are studied with regard to, they have different two main options. One is selfish behavior, and one is a prosocial behavior. And what they find is that, in fact, prosocial behavior is strongly, monkeys evidently show a prosocial behavior. There are three main factors that actually modulate this behavior. One is familiarity, if the animal is actually interacting with an animal that is familiar with. Another one is equal pay, whether or not the other animal is also paid equally compared to the animal that is studied with regard to the option, selfish versus prosocial. The other one is visibility, seeing the animal. And I think I want to emphasize visibility, because I think it's one of the classical features of mirror neuron, the fact that these cells that are motor cells fire to the side of somebody else's action. And I want to switch my brief talk to the research on mirror neurons. I really want to point out only a few studies that link mirror neuron and mirror neuron activity with tendency to empathize with others. Okay, first of all, what are these cells? You probably have seen this slide many times, but just in case you don't know these kinds of data. What you see here, it's the one on top. Of course, there are two main situations. The one in which the monkey on the left side is watching somebody grasping, and the one on the right side in which the monkey grasps. When you look at individual cells and you study the behavior of these cells, the way you graph this behavior is in neurophysiology is with these two things. One is called raster up here, and one is called histogram. Each one of these lines represents a trial, and each one of these little marks represent an action potential. The cell fires or discharges. And you can see that both when the monkey makes the action and when the monkey observes somebody else making the action, there is a discharge of the cell. And the one at the bottom is called histogram, and represents the change in fire rate of the cell. So there is a very robust discharge for both making the action and observing it. You don't need stats to really understand that these cells respond to this experimental condition. And mirror neurons are very well known because of their association with grasping action, because that's the very first discovery was made exactly on these kinds of actions. But the case I want to make today, because it's linked to empathy, is that there are also mirror neurons that respond to facial expression. And the best work in this domain has been done by this guy, Pier Francesco Ferrari. He's an interesting guy. He got his PhD with Elisabetta Wieselberg studying monkeys' behavior, and now he's doing neurophysiology work with Rizzolatti. So he has a very unique background, both ethology and neurophysiology. And you can tell that he knows the monkey's behavior well because he's able to do these kinds of facial expression extremely well. So he has studied mirror neurons responding to these kinds of facial expressions, both ingestive and communicative, like lip smacking. And he shows that, in fact, there are cells that respond to these kinds of situations. And so here you have the observer that has a cell in the brain that fires when the monkey makes the action and when the monkey sees somebody else making the action. So there is an immediate equivalence between making it and seeing somebody else making it. And so it really creates a nice connection between people when it comes to empathy, understanding the emotional states of others. Well, my work is mostly done with brain imaging, although now we're doing some studies in which we record individual cells in the human brain. And we have done a variety of imaging studies in which we have tried to use the monkey data to kind of model the activity that we see in our brain imaging scanner to figure out which regions are rich of these cells. And more or less what comes out of the brain imaging work is that there are two main areas that seem to correspond nicely anatomically with the monkey region that contain these cells. And there are these regions in red that seem to contain these mirror cells. We've done several studies on imitation and also studies on empathy. We started with imitation because, of course, it makes a lot of sense. If you look at the properties of these cells, they fire when you make an action, when you see somebody else making an action, they seem to really be designed for imitation. But in fact, it turns out that imitation is a behavior which is not only pervasive in humans, but is strongly linked also to empathy. And in fact, there is a phenomenon called the chameleon effect that really links well imitation and empathy. It turns out that when you interact socially with other people, you have a tendency to imitate what others do. And you do this automatically. You're not even paying attention to it, and you just do it. But of course, there are individual differences. Some people do it more than others. Some are more chameleons than others. And it turns out that there is a nice link between the tendency to imitate and to be a chameleon and the tendency to empathize. The more you are a chameleon, the more you empathize with other people. There are studies, social psychology studies by John Barge and Tanya Chartrand that show this very nice correlation. We wanted to kind of capture this visually, and so I was with the student. We thought, well, we have to kind of find some picture that really captures this. And because it's political season and there is a lot of neuropolitics here, I think that's the next two pictures that are also in line with the whole theme. And so what we found was that there was a picture of President Carter, and the chief of his staff is giving a speech, and this is the poster that the chief of his staff is making. And later on during the talk, and it really comes out nicely with Carter because he also got the Nobel Prize for Peace, so he really primes this idea of empathy. And in the Conceptual Commons, there is a review article I'm going to publish next year, but which is online already, that really describes some of these studies, if you want to dive more into the literature. So when we thought of these social psychology data, we thought, well, there is a very nice link between imitation and empathy, but what does it tell us in terms of brain system? That's Sam Harris' agenda. Let's figure out, let's map perfectly well brain activity and human behavior. That would be fantastic. In fact, when he finishes doing that, he's going to get his PhD. And so the idea was that, well, if you have a system that is really linked to imitation, which is the mirror neuron system, and we know that there are some areas in the human brain that are classically linked to emotion, especially the limbic system, you have to think that probably there is a larger system in which there is communication between this mirror neuron system and more classical limbic areas that really enable empathy at the level of simulating the mental states and emotional states of others. And so we did an experiment. Our model was pretty much simplified this way. So mirror neurons would simulate the facial expression. You see somebody expressing their emotion with their face. They simulate the facial expression activating in your own brain for the same kind of facial expression. And then in some way, they have to talk to the limbic system such that they trigger the activity that makes you feel the emotion. And if you look at the anatomy, classical limbic areas and the classical mirror neuron areas described by our studies are really linked anatomically by the insula. And so we had this idea that, in fact, this whole large system composed of these three major neural systems would enable this form of empathy that is really based on kind of simulating the emotional states of others, feeling what other people feel. And the study that we published in 2003, basically there were two main predictions: that when you imitate facial expressions of this kind, emotions, basic emotions, and when you see them, you activate in both situations the whole system. So this was a kind of a proof of concept. The study had quite a bit of media coverage, and there were some, and to go back to the theme of politics, there were some titles in the media saying, covering our study, "I feel your pain, I really do." And this was kind of using the line of Bill Clinton in one of his campaigns. So this was some kind of a proof of concept that this could be a system in the brain that helps us simulating the emotions of others and feel what other people feel. But of course, we had no behavioral data that kind of linked in more direct way the activity throughout this system with the tendency to empathize of our subjects. And that's what we have done in the last few years. So we looked at, and we really call these mirror neurons as a biomarker of sociality and empathy. A follow-up study of the study that we published in 2003 is done now with kids. We have a longitudinal project of 5 years in which we recruit kids before they hit puberty. And this is my daughter posing for me. And we use kind of, in the previous study we used the classical Ekman phases. Now we use a more modern set of facial expression that helps us also looking into gender effects, race effects. We haven't analyzed all this data yet, but we have done some initial studies. And one thing that we found was, in fact, that the whole circuitry that I described previously, areas with mirror neurons, the amygdala, and the insula connecting these two, the activity in this region when our kids watch or imitate facial expression has strong correlations with behavioral measures of empathy and interpersonal competence. This one is a graph that shows the activity in the system and the correlation with interpersonal competence. Interpersonal competence it's a scale here that is done through a questionnaire with parents, in which we ask the parents, how popular is your kid, how many play dates he gets, how many friends does he have, and there is a very nice correlation between the activity throughout the system and the social competence of these kids. And we also have correlation with empathy in the whole system, in which the empathic concern of these kids, which is measured again with validated tools, really maps well on activity through the system. So this is a nice evidence that really strongly links this whole neural activity with some behavior in real life. And of course, one of the corollaries of this research was the idea that, in fact, if you have a problem in this system, then you may have a problem in social behavior. Because, of course, mirror neurons may actually make social interactions very smooth, very simple, because you can immediately feel what other people are feeling. And a study that we published a couple of years ago shows this. We have a control group of kids and then a group of children with autism spectrum disorder. And when they do both imitation and observation of facial emotional expression, these are the activity. This is only for imitation. So our typically developing kids show activity classically in motor areas and in visual areas. Of course, they're making the facial expression and they're seeing it, but also in this inferior frontal area that we know contain mirror neurons. Well, actually, we assume, because we don't have direct evidence from these imaging studies. But when it comes to the group of patients with autism, what we get is that there are visual responses and motor responses, but what is lacking are this inferior frontal gyrus activity that we presume is associated with mirror neuron activity. And when you make a contrast between the two groups, what you get is the only areas that really differ is right here. On top of this, we also find correlation between clinical status and brain activity. These are two largely used scales, the ADOS and the ADI, that give you an overall sense of the severity of the autism in the children. And what we found was that the more reduced is the activity in mirror neuron areas, the more impaired is the child. So clearly this is another piece of evidence that suggests that there is a strong link between activity in this region and social behavior. And so far I've been talking only of facial expression, imitating them, watching them. Of course, facial expression really are mapped closely to emotion. But can we actually see something like that, a correlation between activity in these areas and the tendency to empathize with others for simpler actions, for actions that are not even emotional? And then I have to go back an experiment that we published some years ago that a lot of people call the Tea Party experiment. And here the idea was to test the hypothesis that what mirror neurons really care about are not just the actions, but the intentions associated with those actions. There is some evidence that that's the case, but we wanted to test it more directly. And of course, it's not a simple thing to do because you have to reduce intentions, which are really slippery things, in something that you can make an experiment about. And our idea was simply maybe the context in which the same action occurs can give the observer a cue about the intention. So here we have the same grasping action, grasping a mag, and we were using both this whole hand prehension and this precision grip for both the conditions. But there are two different contexts. In one context, the grasping action is, the grasping action here is embedded in context in which you see a neatly organized scene. There are cookies, there is a teapot. It suggests somebody's going to have tea. But here you have the same objects, but now what you see are cookie crumbs, an empty cup, a dirty napkin. It kind of suggests that somebody already had tea. So it's the same grasping action, but what follows is something different. In one case, drinking, in the other one, putting the mug in the dishwasher. And what we found was, in fact, that areas that we presume contain mirror neurons have differential activity between these two situations, with preferential activity for drinking condition, which is also mapped by single unit data in the monkey that show higher activity, higher number of neurons that code for the eating intention in the monkey experiment. So this study really told us that, in fact, these systems seem to be more concerned with the intentions than the action themselves. And then we thought, okay, let's use this stimuli, the same stimuli we used for this experiment, to figure out whether mirror neuron areas really care about the intention of other people. And let's see whether such a simple everyday action, like watching somebody grasping a mug, can trigger activity in mirror neuron areas that correlate with the tendency of empathizing of our subjects. And so we used pretty much the same video clips. And what we found, in fact, was that there was a very nice correlation between scores of empathic concern and also cognitive empathy and activity in these areas when our subjects were watching these really simple actions. These are not actions that are even associated with emotions. So again, this is another evidence that really creates a nice and strong empirical link between activity in these regions and empathic behavior. So the claim I'm going to make today, well, I have plenty of time. I'm going to finish before my time is due. That in fact these systems are systems that I call for secular morality. They come all the way back. They don't require massive belief systems to make us good. And it seems that really evolution has shaped out some systems in the primate brain, and presumably not just in the primate brain, to really be pro-social. And now there's plenty of studies really that are popping up. They're really changing the classical view of the individual as only fighting for self-preservation. And in fact, one of my slogans is that evolution made us wired for empathy. That doesn't mean that we can't actually change our properties, not something that is wired doesn't mean innate in this case. It only means that we have the potential, the neurobiological potential to be empathic. And I think that, one of the moves I want to make today is that it's kind of provoking a little bit of discussion, especially in an audience that makes a living out of arguments, is that in contrast with traditionally held ideas that really think that we are good and empathic and social because of our higher intellect, I often think that our beliefs get in the way and makes us less empathic. And in fact, there are studies looking at interactions between people and between individuals and between groups. It really suggests that individuals seem to be fairly trustful of one another when it comes to one-to-one interactions, but groups are very distrustful of one another. And if you think about it, you describe groups only in a kind of deliberate, explicit way, rather than this kind of implicit, automatic way that mirroring allows you to do. But now there's an interesting twist, because now we have made this discovery that, in fact, we have something in our brain that makes us built for empathy, and we talk about it. So now what has been for centuries or millennia or more than that, something that is pre-reflective, because these cells are really located in the premotor cortex. They send commands to our muscles, and so they really seem to be pre-reflective kind of neural systems. But now we talk about this, and now we are moving our awareness of these systems in our brain into the deliberate, into the explicit discourse. And I think this is great, because in fact we can actually try to make this move and to use these discoveries and our understanding of our own empathic nature to actually kind of change some of the aspects of our society that are not as empathic as they should be. I'm done. Thank you.